Okay, greetings everyone. My name is Taek-soo Kim, and it is my privilege to serve as the Korean Cultural Society of Boston's New Music Symposium. Today, we are having our final session celebrating the two first composers of Korean ancestry in the United States, Earl Kim and Donald Sir. And it is my great pleasure to have a special guest today to give us a remarks. So from Consul General, Honorable Gi-jun Yu is here to give us a brief remark to congratulate us.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, the warmest of welcomes to the final part of the 2021 New Music Symposium by the Korean Cultural Society of Boston. It seems like only yesterday that I was offering my congratulations on the very first session of the New Music Symposium. I'm delighted to have been invited. It is my distinct pleasure to see you all, albeit through a virtual platform. I would like to congratulate the Korean Cultural Society of Boston on the continued successful holding of the 2021 New Music Symposium. Since 2012, the KCSB has clearly been engaging in wholehearted efforts to promote Korean culture in Boston. And it is thanks to their sincere endeavors that this meaningful event to support young Korean American artists has been made possible. For 2 months, under the theme of the convergence of Korean traditional music and new music, we had the chance to see inspiring musicians engage in a profound exploration of Korean traditional music and Western contemporary music. Together, we traveled through terra incognita, that is to say, new ground in the world of music opened by vibrant composers. Indeed, this is well encapsulated in the very title, New Music Symposium. We have all been moved by these noble forms of musical experience generated. It is also a wonderful thing in life to experience something truly unique. In February, we were very impressed by a range of talented musicians, including Jenshu, Gamin, Jiyoung Kim, and Jinny Kim. We were touched as they explored the meeting of their musical worlds with Korean traditional music. Known in Korean as gugak, this ancient art form came to life for us through them. It has been truly heartening indeed to see this trend of Western music being imbued with elements of Korean traditional music and these together creating new harmonies. In April, with the benefit of Professor Taek-soo Kim's splendid presentation and moderation, we gained some insight into how early Korean composers worked in the United States. This marked a wonderful start to the April series of the New Music Symposium. We also had the chance to experience each individual composer's work. It was moving to see how their identity as a Korean could be intertwined with Western culture and how this has been expressed in their music. The 2021 New Music Symposium has played a bridging role. It has served to open up new avenues in cultural interaction through music. And this music is a key element in cultural exchanges. And contemporary musicians have a great role to play in bringing people together. I firmly believe this will serve to nurture, foster, cultivate a real sense of mutual understanding between our two peoples. I trust that it will deepen the bonds. Once again, I'd like to say a heartfelt thank you to the KCSB for the valuable role they have played in ensuring the resounding success of this new music symposium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General Counsel. It's great to hear your encouraging words. And we especially thank, again, the Korean Consulate General in Boston for your sponsorship, and also the Korean Cultural Society of Boston for hosting, especially Dr. Byung Kim, the president, and Ms. Yu Kyung Kim, the chair of the music committee, and all the board members for your support. And it is very exciting for us to have Martha Potter Kim, Eva Kim, Shauna Kim Kent, and Matthew Sir with us today, and other family and friends of Earl Kim and Donald Sir. Now, it is my excitement to introduce our special guests. The first one is Jocelyn Clark. Dr. Jocelyn Clark is a gayagum player, and she teaches at Baekje University, and she's the co-founder and director of Cross Sound New Music Festival, and also founder and director of 3Z Plus, an ensemble of 3 different East Asian zithers and percussion. She also has this picture with both composers. She shared with me, Earl Kim from the left, Earl Kim Eri Ji, who is Dr. Clark's former gayagum teacher, and Soyoung-se or Donald Sir and herself here. And she owns, or she inherited the gayagum of Donald Sir's. And among with us, John Harbison, Professor John Harbison is a composer, a Pulitzer-winning composer, and who teaches at MIT as well. And Maestro David Hughes is with us. He's a conductor and professor emeritus at Boston University, and currently he serves as music director of Collage New Music and Cantata Singers. And this is a newspaper article I found with Donald Sir and David Hughes on the premiere of the slavery documents in South Korea. And Ms. Kyung Kang is arts administrator, higher ed institution consultant. And she is co-founder and executive director of Sejong Soloists, which promoted Earl Kim's music very much. And also she is co-founder of the Great Mountains International Music Festival, currently known as Pyeongchang International Music Festival. Dr. Paul Salerni is a composer, conductor, and pianist. He is a professor and NEH Distinguished Chair in the Humanities at Lehigh University. Lastly, Scott Yu. Maestro Scott Yu is a conductor and violinist, and he's currently serving as chief conductor and artistic director at Mexico City Philharmonic. And he is also the music director of Festival Mosaic, and he is a host and executive producer of a PBS show, Now Hear This. And please join me in welcoming all of these wonderful guest speakers. And we will begin the talk. Okay, so I'd love to ask each of you your relationship with these 2 composers. Some of you might be related only one, but briefly, could you tell us like how your friendship or professional relationship with these 2 composers? I would go from Dr. Salerni first.
Hi, Tae-soo. It's a really honor to be here and to be talking about Earl and Donald, who I was very close to, both of them. I studied with Earl in graduate school from 73 to 79. In 78 and 79, Earl recruited myself and my then fiance, my wife, now wife, Laura Johnson, to help him with narratives. I'm going to put my screen up, if you don't mind, because it'll show my relationship to Earl very clearly. You see my screen? Yeah, so we did narratives with Earl. After I started teaching at Lehigh, Earl brought us back to help him with the workshop performance of Footfalls, the setting of a Samuel Beckett play, which we workshopped, and then we premiered, because Laura was teaching at UCM, the conservatory in Cincinnati, we premiered it there and did it at the Midwest Chamber Opera Festival. From then on, I gave regular concerts of Earl's music at Lehigh, the highlights of which were a 3-concert festival in 1990 in honor of his 70th birthday, where 10 of his students, including Donald and including John Harbison, and including Peter Winkler, who's also here today. At that festival, Earl premiered his choral piece, Some Thoughts on Keats and Coleridge. 95, for his 75th birthday, we did a 2-concert festival where Accordion, a piece he wrote for Margit Kern, a wonderful accordionist from Germany, had its premiere, and then we premiered it later. And since Earl passed away, we've done concerts at least to knowledge each of the 5-year birthdays of Earl. This year we did 6 concerts in honor of Earl, 4 art song recitals because he loved art songs so much, a concert where we did his 2 major Beckett works, that are Ajo and Footfalls, and also a concert that included Rattling On. Donald was also a regular visitor at Lehigh. We did a performance of Red Dust at the Earthlight Festival. Oh no, that was earlier. We did Satori on Park Avenue and also his Lacrimosa. We knew Donald very well simply because we were often with Earl in his home, but my wife Laura, when I was away on a fellowship, rented a room from Donald's sister in the apartment underneath Donald. So she got to know Donald very well, and all of his wonderful knowledge about everything in the world and his passion for knowledge, especially Lorca, because Laura was doing a performance of Lorca for her master's thesis, as well as Vivaldi, and all of the wonderful things. When Donald delved into something, he just delved it too deeply. So in some ways, Earl is really the center of my life. Except for my own music, it's the music I've been devoted to for as long as I've known Earl.
Great, and thank you so much for sharing your story. And next, on my Zoom screen, I have Dr. Clark next to you. So may I invite Dr. Clark to talk about your relationship to those composers?
Yes, I think I was introduced to Donald Sir through Milan Hetmanik, who was my advisor at the time. And he's actually here on this Zoom call today. And Milan was a roommate of Donald Sir during the 1980s. He lived together with his mother, Donald Sir's mother, and Donald when he was writing the slavery documents. And when I became a grad student, Donald, because I played Kayagam, Donald, and I was involved with composers, Donald introduced, I think he told, Milan told Donald about me, and then Donald just called me out of the blue. He says, "Who are you? I want to know you. Let's meet." So after that, we became friends for the last part of his life, from around 1994 until 1999. And he was very didn't talk much about himself, but eventually, because I was also interested in new music, I was taking Music 51 at the time at Harvard, so I was writing little pieces in the style of Bach, this kind of thing, and eventually married a composer myself, and started the music festival in Alaska. He started introducing his music to me over tape at the time, and wanted me to write my dissertation on Chunhyang, the story of Chunhyang and Pansori, because it was before the book had come out of Hawaii at that time. So he just was a friend, and he hung out and we talked about Korean music. He was very interested, and he asked me to borrow books for him from the Harvard Yenching Library. He was particularly interested in the Sejong Shillok, the veritable records of Sejong, because in those books you can find scores from we just had the 600th anniversary of King Sejong here in Seoul last year, 2 years ago. So he was very interested in how to read Korean scores, and that's what I'd been studying before I came to Harvard. So we looked at scores together, Korean traditional scores and notation, and going through the scores in the Harvard Yenching Library, which eventually got moved over to the music library at Loeb. But those are the kind of things we did together. And then I did for the opening when Harvard combined all its Korean studies, Japanese studies, and Chinese studies into the Asia Center. I produced a new music, I commissioned new pieces of instruments and composers from Japan, China, and Korea. And then he was, involved in advising me when we put together that concert for the Asia Center, and that's where that photo was taken, because I invited my teachers from Japan, China, and Korea to come play together. And so my teacher Chi Eri was playing in that concert. And at that time, Earl Kim came. I didn't know him as well, but of course, he was around Boston, and I was involved with composers, so I met him several times. I went to his funeral as well when he passed away. My teacher, who is in the picture, was invited over to his house after our concert, and she told me that she was interested in his kayagam hanging on the wall and offered to fix it up for the family. And because all the wood had sort of moved spaces, moved over time, because I think it'd been hanging on the wall. When she pulled the strings out to retighten them, she couldn't get them back in, and I think she needed a drill to get them back into the instrument. And this freaked everybody out. So she told me this story from Earl Kim's house, but mostly I knew Donald Sir.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your stories. Next, Dr. Harbison, Professor Harbison, can I ask you about your story?
Yes, I did feel that I need to compress a little bit here. I met Earl when I was in high school. I grew up in Princeton and knew some of the people in the music department, and was introduced to Earl because I was a high school composer, and eventually studied with him as a graduate student some years later at Princeton. Then later, of course, when he came to Harvard, went to his classes quite often just as a guest, occasionally brought some music into those classes at that time too. This was in the 70s. My history with Donald is somewhat the same period. We were students together in Earl's class in 1961. Donald then actually moved to Cambridge the same year as my wife and I did, 64. And we actually kept a lot of his instruments for him when he went to Korea for quite a long stretch in the 60s, and heard from him rarely, but significantly, I think, during that important period of his life. And of course, we're party to and witnesses to what's already been alluded to, his extraordinary, obsessive and very productive interests, Vivaldi, slavery documents, which led to this incredibly major piece, which he wrote for cantata singers, and valued Donald to this very day as a completely unique experience. Someone who you never knew what he was going to say until he said it, and then you couldn't have imagined him saying anything else. I'll just leave that as it is for the moment.
Thank you very much. I cannot wait to talk about those more soon. And next, Maestro Yu, would you talk about yourself with the relationship?
Hi, I didn't know Donald or Earl as long as most of the other guests. I met Earl in 1995. We met, I think, at the Marble Music Festival. And soon Earl and Martha kind of became my second parents. I always stayed with them in Cambridge. At that time, I was running a chamber orchestra in Boston called Metamorphosen. And they took us to Korean food, Chinese food, just everything was kind of centered around food. They had an amazing dining room table in their kitchen that we all admired. And through Earl, I met Donald, and I remember being fascinated by a man who had studied all of Vivaldi's concertos. I remember thinking that is an extraordinary person who would do something like that. And I ended up playing some of Donald's music. I did his violin concerto and his piece called Berceuse, which is still one of my favorite pieces. And it was really an honor and a privilege to know both of them.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your stories. Next, we have Miss Kang here. Ms. Kang, would you mind talking about yourself with relation to other composers?
Of course. Okay, so I'm so glad to join a distinguished panel of participants here. And I've met Earl Kim, well, my main role with a relationship with Earl Kim is that I presented his music many times. But when I met him, actually, I saw him at, I cannot even say I met him. I saw him at Aspen Music Festival. I used to spend my summers there and just kind of said hello and bowed, and that was about it. But when he passed away, a Korean magazine asked me if I would write an article. So I'll just share that with you briefly. No, actually, this computer is not set up. I mean, it'll take me some time to set it up to share the screen, so I'll just skip that. But I wrote an article about him, and I asked Martha if I could interview her to get materials about it. So that's how I got to know him through Martha, and then Martha said, I must meet Borsalini, and so on. And then we presented, Sejong Solo has presented his music many times at Aspen Music Festival and Kennedy Center and Manchester Music Festival in England and so on. So I got to know his music by presenting and also by knowing Martha and Paul.
Great. Yeah, we will talk about all your wonderful presentation of Earl Kim's music. And lastly, we have here Maestro Hus, who will talk about his relationship with these two composers and their music. Oh, Maestro Hus, you're muted.
Earl Kim, probably after a performance that he conducted of The Marriage of Figaro in Sanders Theatre in Cambridge. And it was a very unusual performance in that it seemed largely to be at about a triple or quadruple piano level for the entire time. It was a concert performance, so of course the orchestra had to play quietly. But it was extraordinarily unusual for its detail and its very delicate nature for the entirety of those 3+ hours that the Marriage of Figaro takes. And then probably also after a performance that he gave with cantata singers long before I was music director of the Mozart Ave Verum Corpus, that was led in complete dark in the auditorium. Later, I played in a chamber ensemble that he and Martha Potter Kim led called Ariel, and it existed for a few years. I don't recall exactly how many years, but I played in that and conducted some. And that was a very exciting time in my own musical life for my getting to know Earl Kim. I actually played the conch in a performance that the ensemble gave of Donald Sear's Red Dust. I've also conducted a couple of Earl's pieces, Scenes from a Movie, Part 3, and some thoughts on Keats and Coleridge, which are quite beautiful works. I knew Donald much better than I did Earl, and I met him probably when, I know I met him when Collage New Music, perhaps on the encouragement of John Harbison, asked me to guest conduct a concert that included 2 of Donald's tiny katanas, one of which we heard a little bit of before this event. And I was always surprised that Donald and I ever became friends, because I remember arguing with him mostly in the car as I drove him home from rehearsals that were taking place in Frank Epstein's basement about his very peculiar rhythmic notation that was nearly impossible to process at the kind of breakneck speeds that Donald wanted. And it said something to me that he listened to every one of my reasons for why that rhythmic notation was really not workable. He listened with great openness and said, golly, I never thought of that. And he would giggle softly and he would say, wow, I have to think about that. And then the rhythmic notation never changed. He stuck with it all his life. My relationship with Donald went from those performances of the katanas to ultimately to the commissioning and performance of his largest work, The Slavery Documents, in 1990. And with performances of many works of his in between and after his death. Donald and I, as you saw from the little thing that Teksu put on the screen, Donald and I took Slavery Documents to, well, we didn't take it, we took the music to Seoul, Korea, where he and I worked on the first Korean performance of that work. We can talk about that later. But Donald and I he was extraordinarily important to me and remains so. He sits over my shoulder right here, as you can see. And as John says, a very unusual man with very unusual observations, obsessions, as Scott has said, obsessions about Vivaldi. He always claimed that you had to listen to at least 200 of the Vivaldi concerti before you could even begin to understand that music. And he was obsessed with things like the glass harmonica and ancient hunting horn calls, which show up in some twisted way in his Unicorn and the Lady. And of course, American slavery that I hope we'll get to talk about. He was a man of very fresh observations, so much so that after a performance of 3 hours of the St. Matthew Passion that I had led, he came back afterwards and he said, David, don't you think that B natural in the last chord and that C minor chord of the suspension in the last chord should just never resolve, just go on forever? And he, of course, is right. It wouldn't have fit Bach's language, but emotionally, he's absolutely right. And he was always observing, seeing things in ways that none of us would predict, and that at the same time often seemed quite right.
I see. Thank you very much for sharing those stories. So today we are going to listen to some excerpts of their music, two by each composer, and we will have a follow-up discussion that would lead us to other topics as well. So the first piece we would love to hear, listen to together is Earl Kim's Where Grief Slumbers. Among them, we will listen to the very first movement together with watching the score. So that was the first movement of Where Grief Slumbers by Earl Kim. And so there are lots of things to talk about, but I would love to focus on his use of text, because we will talk about his other part with a different music. But I would love to invite Dr. Salerni to talk about how special he was about handling the text first.
As you heard, it was interesting. I think Earl, in some ways, found his voice by, and you can take this for what it means, by translating so precisely what was in the text. In the 60s and 70s, he only set texts by Beckett, and the rhythm, the ethos, the sparseness, the meaning of that text, he so captured with the absolute most economical means possible. The cliche that's always applied to Earl, which I think he adopted, was that he reduced everything to the maximum. And what's magical for me is that with this absolute economy of means, it's, first of all, so beautiful, it's so precise, and it is so direct emotionally. I mean, you cannot help but, in my mind, understand what's going on in that poem. I mean, and it's extremely literal. The poem by Apollinaire basically is structured the way you see it in the score, and that the lines going down are exactly how the syllables go down in the poem. And, you know, every time a word recurs, it's the same pitches. It's almost so obvious. And at the same time, it is so beautifully crafted and so economical that it imparts the message and somehow blossoms into something more meaningful and emotional. For me, the best example from where Greece slumbers is the fourth song called Ophelia, where the first part of the song is absolutely a cappella, just the singer. And it's all in a kind of B-flat harmonic minor thing, but somehow he gets everything out of that. And my anecdote about this is that there was a performance by the Cincinnati Symphony, and my wife's opera mentor, Italo Tayo's wife, Inela Tayo, went to the performance. Inela did not like modern music, but she said, Paul, when Ophelia came on and that singer sang those beautiful notes, I started to weep. So for me, that's how he takes what's there in the text and somehow finds the most economical way to express it and to kind of get every possible emotional thrust out of it.
I see. I think you're absolutely right about it, and you can hear it from his music. That's another thing that, you know, you can see it sometimes, but also you can hear it. That's a magical thing to me as well. You briefly mentioned the name Beckett, and it is well known that he admired Beckett and the other way around as well. So, Ms. Kang, what do you think that draws or caught attention of Earl Kim in Beckett's writing and vice versa?
I think Paul and Martha will be the person to answer that, but maybe I can say, because I give some contribution where I didn't know Earl Kim and I only heard his music. So maybe from that point, like what I can imagine is, although it could be farthest from the truth, maybe there is an angle from just person who's just listening to his music and not have known him, or, you know, Beckett. And I think that we presented, Sejong Soloist presented at least 2 Earl Kim pieces that were based on Beckett's text, and one was Ejo, and there was another one, or maybe I'm getting confused with dear Linda, that's Anne Sexton. So when we translated Ejo in Korean, there was not a word that you could take out in that entire 23-minute drama. And I think Earl Kim's music is like that too, and which was just Paul's point. And he just knew that kind of, I think that Beckett's use of language and aesthetics and the communication, the direct communication, really spoke to him. And that was I think that's why he was so drawn to it. But I think Paul can say much more accurately.
Well, part of the reason Earl was attracted to Beckett was simply for the subject matter. I mean, Earl, as many of you know, was one of the first human beings as an Army intelligence officer in World War II to fly over Nagasaki after the bomb dropped. And Martha can confirm this. I mean, he was had nightmares about this, and I think he started the Musicians Against Nuclear Arms because he saw what this was, and he saw the devastation and that kind of apocryphal feeling that you get from Beckett. I think Earl got onto, but I also just think that somehow the nonlinear quality of Beckett, and the idea even of authoritarianism versus democracy, all those things that are in Beckett, Earl as even being glommed onto. So it was both the content and the form. You know, things were not linear. If you listen to Earl's music, especially the Beckett music, it's not linear. It's always episodic. And he said he had two epiphanies. One was Beckett. The other was seeing the Japanese rock garden at the Brooklyn Botanical Garden, where these seemingly unrelated collections of rocks, when seen as a whole, produces a very important picture. And I think in some ways that can help describe kind of the architecture of Earl's music. So there were just a lot of reasons why Beckett was the kind of trigger for Earl's own voice.
So at this point, I'd love to invite all the other panels if you have like an objection or something to add to what we heard. Professor Harbison, for example, do you agree with both comments?
I remember when I was a graduate student, Earl did a rather unusual thing. He showed us Dead Calm, which was the first of the exercices en route pieces that he set, the Beckett text, which I thought was a good thing to do with a bunch of students, something I think that we should probably do more often as composition teachers. He had each sort of small segment of the piece on a separate page. It wasn't exactly clear to at that stage how they were going to link up or what the timing was going to be. Eventually, I conducted the premiere of that piece at Princeton with Bethany Beardsley. And of course, among the things I remember is that those discrete events remained discrete. That is the continuity, as Paul was saying, the continuity was not particularly forward driven, but much more of the presentation. And of course, the piece is very much involved with palindromes, which is another favorite technique of Earl, which kind of encloses that unit by the nature of the shape. So, and of course, the other thing I remember, which has already been mentioned, is that we would do a reading in rehearsal, which I would think we were really getting it. And he would come up and say, very softly, "Now let's hear pianissimo."
Right. Okay. That shows how he was as a musician. That's great. So we will move on to Donald Searle just to get a contrast about how he approached to text. And then I think the best one would be the aforementioned slavery document. So we will listen to a little bit of excerpt of that, and then we will continue to talk.
first part. End of the first.
Yes. So this is courtesy of Maestro Hus, who had this recording, unofficial recording, and this is, as I understand, this is the end of the first half. So, Maestro Hus, may I invite you to talk about this performance a bit and the process and other things as well? Maestro, you're muted. Excuse me.
Okay, sorry. Slavery Documents is a 74-minute piece that is in two parts, the first part of which is 25 minutes long. And this is, as you say, the end of that first part. It's a work for 4 soloists, very large orchestra, organ, and very large chorus. John and I have already mentioned, and Scott too, that Donald had obsessions, and they were always interesting. Probably the biggest obsession in his life was with the topic of American slavery. And it was a topic that led to a decade-long obsession with the issue, one that he probably learned very little about when he grew up in Hawaii. He happened on Bruce Catton's little book about the American Civil War, This Hallowed Ground. And he said that he was stunned. And through that and through much reading and research that he spent years doing, he began to see that American slavery was a subject that the United States had really never dealt with. And he came to believe that its failure to address slavery was going to be the country's Achilles heel. This was a long time ago, and we can think about where we are today. His research into for slavery documents took over 5 years, and the libretto, which took almost that entire time to assemble, is in itself a work of art. The piece, even though it's 70 minutes long, was actually not complete because he always envisioned a second equally long part that he was working on when he died. He'd written a maybe 2 or 3 minutes of that, what was probably to be another hour plus worth of music. The musical language of slavery documents is very different than the earliest music of Donald's that you would hear in the Katenas or in The Unicorn and the Lady, which was essentially non-tonal and always very rapid, often very rapid and angular. And this is cast, as you can hear, in a much more tonal language, much more straightforward, but still with Donald's very unusual sense of time. Things go on much longer than you might expect, or much shorter than you might expect, and you never quite know where this music, even though it's cast in triads and recognizable harmonic and melodic ideas, is always going in an unexpected place. To me, it's unflinching music for its addressing the issue. One of the most powerful lines in it, which he drew the texts from biblical texts that were biblical verses that were used to justify somehow the idea of American slavery, and other writings of the era, some that were lists of punishments for slaves, some that were by Cotton Mather, and other writers in the 17th and 18th centuries. One of the lines that is most painful to hear is when the soprano sings, "Is it possible that any of my slaves could go to heaven, and must I see them there? This music lets the speakers of the day indict themselves, and us for that matter. Donald wrote that the juxtaposition of African-American gospel sounds and Baroque musical invention suggested to him that the conflicting sides of the Enlightenment, when the founding fathers were not able to deal with the issue of slavery in creating the new nation. I now see that indeed this failure haunts our country down to the present day. And of course, that present day was 1990. There were many arguments at the time, at the inception of this work, about the advisability of a Korean American composer born in Hawaii, interpreting musically the sacred texts of the Black experience. Some people in Boston believed that it was not an appropriate topic for young African American students to be exposed to. And Donald said, God help us if the society if the society restricts your work to being just within your own ethnic enclave, then there's no hope for this country. That, despite much resistance in Boston, it received great support from Henry Hampton, from Eyes on the Prize, Judith Jameson, from Alvin Ailey, soprano Jesse Norman, and of course, composer T.J. Anderson, who was a great colleague and friend of Donald's. The performance, in Donald's mind, the performance required not only the large orchestra and large chorus and soloists, but that the chorus itself be racially mixed, that it be basically 50-50 African-American and Caucasian or otherwise. And so it was in the first performance. And in fact, in that performance in Symphony Hall, Boston, the audience too looked very different than the audience that you might have seen at a Friday afternoon Boston Symphony Orchestra concert. A couple of years later, or maybe a year later, as I mentioned, Donald and I went to Seoul, Korea, for performances with the Korean Broadcasting Symphony Orchestra and gathered church choirs. It was interesting rehearsing the piece with the church choirs, who were quite open to it, singing in English. All of the performers were Korean except for me and the banjo player who came with us from the United States. And afterwards, I asked Donald, I said, what did they think of this piece that's about American slavery? And he said that he thought they saw the piece as a metaphor for the treatment of the Koreans at the hands of the Japanese during World War II. And I think the piece is, while it doesn't need to function as a metaphor for anything, because it is powerful unto itself, it has resonance outside itself for all manner of people. To me, it's clearly Donald's biggest work, and I think it is the one that he would want to be remembered by. Although I think he would also have as much love for his 3-minute catena for 4 instruments.
That's great. Very complex story, and also very timely to us, I think. And as we see in the chat, many people agree with us, I think. How was the reception? Some of you were attending or hearing about the performance of the slavery documents, and was it received as intended, or was it mixed?
The reception in Boston on the part of the audience was overwhelmingly positive. The reception from the press was mixed. Some people saw the piece as derivative, which I do not believe it is. And some people saw it in for all the freshness that it had. I think the telling force, however, is that the piece has not received a lot of subsequent performances. Cantata singers that gave the premiere gave a second performance some years later on a concert in which a second Slavery Documents work, this one composed by T.J. Anderson, also on original texts, was given in Symphony Hall. And the Atlanta Symphony performed on a Martin Luther King Day concert, part one of Slavery Documents. And other than the two performances in Seoul, Korea, the work has never been done again. And that's for two reasons, I think. One, the materials are in Donald's hands. Donald has never had a music publisher. The works do not have an avenue to be disseminated. None of his works do. And then there is the issue of the topic itself, which is fraught and which many people find challenging, and some people still believe is not appropriate in the hands of this Korean American composer. I don't agree, but I think that there are many organizations that are actually afraid of the work. Not for its musical language is very approachable, but for the challenge that the piece puts right in front of the listener.
That is great. And there are a couple of things we can draw from what you just told me. And I will save a couple for a later discussion. But let's talk about how being Korean is related to this text, as well as so many other things. And Donald Sir himself studied Korean music for 4 years and had stayed in touch with mainland Korea for a while. And now I would love to invite Dr. Clark to talk about his relationship to Korean.
I was just typing in the, after listening to Mr. Ho's talk. I was reminded of last night. I was corresponding with both Hwang Won-mook, who was Hwang Byung-gi's son, and Donald was very close with Hwang Byung-gi, the composer in Korea. And the other person who Donald was close to, the person that introduced me to Donald was, as I said, Mylon Hetmanik. And he reminded me, he was my professor of Joseon history, and he lived with the Sirs in Donald's mother and also Donald in the 1980s. And he was close to Donald's mother, Betty Sir, or Bodok Sir, Seo Bodok, Bokdok. And so I started to write what Mylon had written in the chat, but I didn't get to the end of it before my name came out. And but I think it relates to what David Hughes was saying, because Donald actually does have a background that probably led to how he could write his interest in the slavery documents. You can see in the chat part of what Mylan wrote to me last night. That his mother Betty was very much involved in the March 1st movement of 1919 in Korea, which is part of the fighting against a Japanese occupation of Korea. And she was a young schoolgirl then. And she took to the streets with her classmates yelling, "Long live Korean independence," and got arrested, which, alarmed his mother, his mother's mother, who took her out of school and wanted to marry her off. And so, she didn't want to be married off in Korea. She wanted to get out of the Japanese occupation. So she's the one who volunteered to become a picture bride and go to America, which is how she ended up in Hawaii, where she worked as a seamstress, but also was very involved in Korean independence movement from America through her church, the Methodist Church, which may also explain a little bit how the text Donald used from the Bible maybe showed up in the slavery documents. Anyway, slavery was a topic in Korea as well. Korea was a slave society in old times. So this topic of slavery, the topic of independence, the topic of freedom was very close to Koreans' hearts, especially from that era. And I'm sure that Donald, maybe at the end of our talk, Mylan can sort of chime in and discuss this in more detail. But it seems to me that Donald had a background that led to his writing of slavery documents. As far as my own work with Donald went, as I said, also in terms of what David has said about the time and rhythm in Donald's pieces, one of the things that I looked at with Donald was these old in the veritable records of the various kings of Korea, which we had in the Harvard Yenching Library, which is now finally digitized, was the veritable records of King Sejong. And King Sejong was sort of established the culture of Chosun Korea. And one of the ways he did that was to sort of rewrite all of Korea's music, to sort of establish the dynasty on music, which was very important in sort of this new Confucian way of thinking about, government in relationship to sound. And so in there you have, in those records, you have scores that Sejong wrote. Well, he didn't write them himself, but he commissioned basically music to found the dynasty on. And when we hear these pieces are played today still in Korea at the National Kugak Center. And these pieces, I don't know how they were played back then. We had a symposium 2 years ago for the 600th anniversary of King Sejong. They are very slow pieces. They're large and very slow. And the way these are written and the percussion also used in these pieces, I think we find this in the Red Dust piece. I've only heard the American version of it, but I can imagine it with the original Korean instruments that he wrote for, how it might sound, and might sound in a sort of different sounds than you can hear in the American version of it with non-Korean percussion. But I imagine that some of his, relationship to rhythm and also slavery documents come out of his background as a Korean composer, as a Korean, and as someone who, spent from 1964 to 1968 studying these kind of scores at the National Kugak Center, which, was barely sort of up and going by then. They'd moved the Kugak Center, which was originally the court division of the palace, became the National Kugak Center during the Korean War in the 50s, from 50 to 55. It would move down to Busan, where Hwang Byung-gi, his sort of Korean brother, I went last night to look at Korean sources for things about Donald during the time he was here in Korea. So I was looking at Korean newspaper articles about Donald's performances here. And I found especially writings of Hwang Byung-gi, who was one of my teachers, who really thought of Donald as a brother. And I think probably spent a lot of time showing Donald Korean scores, introducing him to especially the Kayagum. And of course, when Donald died, he left his Kayagum, one to me and one to Hwang Byung-gi's son, Hwan Wonmuk, who couldn't be here today. But both of us really treasured these instruments. The other instruments he had was a lot of percussion instruments in his home. Before he passed away, we talked a lot about this music he was writing for Silence Broken, which is a documentary about the comfort woman in Korea, this issue about comfort women. And he was really asking about how to use Korean instruments for this score that he wrote for the film. And he also had a lot of percussion music instruments, and he was interested in talking about how to write for how to use these instruments that he had. So I think a lot of the percussion instruments also went to Hwang Byung-gi's son, Hwang Wonmuk, after he passed away.
Wow. Yeah. So no, that's so basically the sense of time and his interest in Korean instruments were I would summarize in this way of about his interest in and the influence of Korean tradition in his music. Please correct me if I'm not correct, but so, and the topics as well. But essentially, still, I think they are both of them, Earl Kim and Donald Sawyer, were American composers, right? And Western music composers. And I think that's more common understanding of them. And at this point, I'd love to just listen to two pieces back to back, both the last pieces by these two composers. And then I will invite Master Yu to talk about these two pieces because he performed both pieces. So let's listen to Sir's last piece, Versus, first. Just the beginning, though. And here is Earl Kim's violin concerto, the third part, not the third movement, recorded by Master Yu. Excuse me. Okay, so Maestro Yu, could you talk about these pieces from a standpoint of a performer? I mean, it's beautiful, everyone would say that, but we're curious why they're so great. What's the charm of these pieces?
I wasn't the performer in the Sir. I don't know who recorded that, but it's a beautiful recording. The Berceuse, which is the first piece you heard, I think I did the premiere performance in a few months before Donald passed away, and Martha and I, if I remember correctly, this was 20 years ago, Martha and I were talking very frequently about whether Donald was going to come to the premiere, and he did. And I remember I hugged him, and he was just very, very skinny because he was already very, very ill. And that piece is very difficult to play because it's all on the E string, and it's very slow and exposed. And if you make a mistake, even somebody who didn't know music would understand. But very rewarding piece. Earl's Violin Concerto, that was played by Earl and Martha's very close friend, Cecilia Arshevsky, who was like a family member to them. And we made that recording, I believe, in 2004 or 2005. And Martha came to Dublin, where we recorded it, to sort of supervise the sessions, which I'm really grateful that she was there, because she knew the music better than anybody except for Earl himself. And I think his violin concerto is one of the hardest things to play on the violin. I mean, it makes Paganini look pretty easy because it's so technically demanding, and it was very demanding of the orchestra. I remember feeling at the end of that week with that orchestra that the orchestra was truly won over by the music, that they didn't know about Earl's music, but they were glad to get to know it through these 3 or 4 days of recording his violin concerto, a piece called Dialogues, which was for piano and orchestra, a piece called Cornet, which was for orchestra with narrator, and Earl's nephew was the narrator, and of course this violin concerto. And I wish that Earl's music and Donald's both got more performances. It's as Mr. Hoos knows, it's easy to get a first performance, but it's hard to get that second performance. That's often harder to get than the first. One other thing I'd just like to say about both of them was they were two of the nicest people I ever knew, but extremely picky about their own music, especially about balance. I remember I asked Earl once, why are you giving that to the second violin? Why don't you just give it to the first violin? And he said, well, because it's just going to overbalance. It was like the third of a chord or something. It was a diatonic chord. And I just said, why are you bothering giving that to the seconds? And he said, well, it'd be too strong. So he was so meticulous and so sensitive about those types of things. And I've remembered that ever since. And Donald too. He was very, very careful about how he voiced chords. In the Berceuse, I remember saying, "Oh, it's interesting. You left out the fifth of that chord." And it says, "Yes, the music." He said something to the effect of, "The music can't bear that, or it can't bear that weight." And I thought, these are two men cut from the same cloth for sure.
Yeah, wow. No, that I can understand that. But you just mentioned what I wanted to just bring up right away. So undoubtedly, these pieces are gorgeous and their music is amazing. And I think we all agree with that idea. But how can we get them performed more often? what would be the issue? Or I don't know. I mean, yeah.
I think one of the things that we're going to try to do, Martha and I have planned, of course, the pandemic got in the way, but Martha and I had planned to properly engrave the violin concerto either this year or next. And I volunteered to do that myself. I would be very happy to engrave Donald's violin concerto and his pursuits, which are the Comfort Women film. I didn't realize that had come out. I had recorded part of the soundtrack, but I'm curious to see what that sounds like. I'd be very happy to participate in the effort to engrave that music. But I think the big issue would be to get slavery documents engraved. That would be, it's just such a monumental work and so important in Donald's output to somehow figure out a way to get the money together to get those pieces engraved and then to get somebody to publish them. Because yes, especially Donald, his music is just, nobody knows about it. And that's really a shame for humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just add that when you go to engrave the violin concerto, there's a piano reduction that I did that's with Presser, but I'm sure we can get it out of Presser, which we should do.
I actually engraved the longest and most complex of the catenas and the Sartorio on Park Avenue and the Epistrophe, but those are easy to do. And as Scott said, the real challenge for Donald's music is slavery documents. The piano reduction for the choral score exists in Donald's hands. The only orchestra score is in Donald's hands. It's very neat and readable, but it will never work until the piece is properly engraved.
And David, by Donald, you mean Matthews, right? It's probably Matthew has it. Is Matthew here?
Matthew, I think is here.
Right?
I actually have, I have the score that I used in slavery documents. There is I think the original onion skins, because that's how it was done in those days, are at Tufts, where Donald's works are kept.
Mm-hmm.
Matthew, can you unmute yourself?
I thought I saw him.
Yeah, he's under Claudia Cimenti.
Okay, I'll make him as a co-host so that he can unmute himself.
Hello?
And okay, Matthew.
Yes. Well, as David said, most of the manuscripts are at Tufts. I do have a few things here in Europe, but not much. As most of you probably know, I'm living in Luxembourg right now, so I'm some distance away from Boston. So, but well, this certainly gives me new impetus to try to help get things published for sure. So I want to thank all of you for coming, and TechSoup, especially you, for helping to organize this very interesting and moving presentation here. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And yes, slavery documents, and the libretto is on Maestro Hus have the libretto somewhere, and then he would be willing to share it with those who are interested later. But it's the same with Erkim's music. I think both of them. I mean, Erkim had probably like a couple more CDs out, but I don't think that's enough either. Well, and Donald Star had only one posthumous CD. I think it's really striking that both of these deserving composers need more attention. What about Erkim's case? What would hinder him from getting pieces performed more often? Either Master Yu or Ms. Kang can talk about it. or Paul, Dr. Salerni, excuse me for informality.
Well, let me say something about his. Let me say something about his music theater works on Beckett. They're actually not difficult to do and not big. So A. Joe is just a narrator, an actor. There's some technology involved, 3 string players and 3 brass players. His other wonderful setting of Beckett called Footfalls is just 2 percussion players, a mezzo in the pit and a soprano on stage. And what the impediment was, in fact, the impediment for Ms. Kong to not do it was she could never see a good video. And I'm happy to announce that as of February 29th, just before COVID hit, my wife and I did production at Lehigh where we got a naturally good video. So for anybody who is interested and wants to do A. Joe, which is an extraordinary piece in Footfalls, which is actually one of my favorite pieces of Earl's, there is a video record that really shows how the piece goes and how effective it is. So it's just a matter of finding the right people to show this video to so that they can do it, because they're very doable works.
I wanted to say that given especially what Scott said about both Donald's and Earl's being very specific in their desires for their pieces, the balance of this note in the chord, that is true. And there is something unnerving about performing either music by either one of them. In the case of Some Thoughts of Keats and Coleridge, a cappella work, I've heard numbers of performances. My wife has led performances. I've led performances, and they looked very simple on the page, and you can kind of be terrified in the moment of performing them. And in the case of Donald's music, it's that rhythmic issue, but it's also that Donald liked the performers to be on edge. The first time I was leading a performance of his Sartorio on Park Avenue, which is based on the first 4 notes of T for 2, a kind of obsessive piece. He said, well, it sounds really good, but I wish it weren't conducted. I wish you wouldn't conduct it. I said, we tried it. And I said, the players were just horrified. They were terrified, mainly because they kept getting lost. There's nothing complex about the piece, but it goes on and on and on and on with repetitions of an idea, and you could really not know where you are unless somebody is at least holding your hand to a certain degree. And I said, the players, we tried it without the conductor, without my conducting it. I said, the players are just too nervous. He said, I like it that way. I like the players to be on edge. And it is true that there is something special in a performance of Sartori or the Epistrophe or those, or probably the Catenas, that would make them quite special if they were, when the players are both quite knowledgeable about the piece and also a little bit on edge. I don't think that those should be inhibiting factors because, as Paul says, the music is extraordinarily effective in performance, and they are very communicative composers. So I just think that there is that little bit of a wall for the performers, that idea that there is music that actually looks simple and is actually quite difficult.
So speaking of challenge, we, courtesy of Ms. Kang, we have a brief excerpt of Dear Linda that they own, and you will see some of them might look very challenged, especially thinking about it's narrated by not necessarily musician. So, but I just wanted to share it with you briefly. And in this video also, Dr. Solerini is featured.
Love you. Love you. Love you.
And if you recognize the face, that is Yoon Yajong-Yoon, who just won the Oscar. So I thought it was just a timely to share the piece, and also to show the difficulty in performing it as well. We will continue this conversation afterwards, but it's already 8:30 in Eastern time. So we are going to end the official panel, the live streaming, and then afterwards we will continue the informal conversation on Zoom, and everyone is invited to contribute and talk. And also a short survey, as well as all these comments. There are lots of great comments. Peter Winkler and Dorothea Cook gave us some background stories about the violin concerto also being also on text. And the verses you listened to was performed by Collageny Music, and lots of other interesting information will be sent to you. So, and we would really appreciate if you take some time, because the survey is from the Consul General of Korea in Boston, and they will love to just how these events impact on others' lives, and so it would be very important to us. And then music making is just continuing in. So this is a promotion. And the Korean Cultural Society of Boston would continue making more music, and the next series you are going to see is Dear Mother, combining the stories of adopted musicians and dancers of Korean ancestry. And then also, it's not related to Korean Cultural Society, but Min Kwan is here with us, and she is going to present 75 pieces based on America the Beautiful, as it embraces all the diverse voices, including Earl Kim and Donald Sir. So she commissioned 75 composers, including Professor Harbison and myself. So if you're interested in that premiering in July, please visit the website as well. And I'd love to say special thanks to Mark Devoto, who actually have the list of Donald Sir's music that the Tufts University owns, and Mary Lindquist, Frank O'Terry, composer and journalist, and Greg Steinke, composer, who had interviewed with me to help all this event. And also, even though they are not here with us, we got special greetings from TJ Anderson, Martin Brody, Rob Dimmer, Itzhak Perman, and Don Upshaw. And everyone, it's a great pleasure to have you here. And again, we will continue our conversation on Zoom, but to those who are watching on Facebook Live now, we would say bye.
Thank you, Teksu.
Thank you.